Yeah, I'm really delighted to have Parami here. So this actually came out of a conversation. I think we were on an order gathering of some kind, a little breakout room, and you were saying, "I'd love to come over to Dublin." And I said, "Oh well, you can." And then a little while later, I was just watching something on the Channel 4 player called "It's a Sin," which is about the AIDS crisis in London in 1980s. And I remember having a conversation with Parami about that particular time, and I thought maybe the sort of two things came together. This idea of, well, that was people at that time talked about the virus. That was the sort of thing that really hit me. And then I remember only this time last year, people were talking about the virus, and there's a few other connections. One was hearing about, in the 1980s, gay men were beaten up just because people out of fear and paranoia. And I remember an incident again about this time last year where a Chinese guy in London was beaten up for being Chinese and told to take his virus back to China or something like that. And I thought it might be interesting to explore that time and in the 80s and see if there were some parallels that we might find between what was going on then and what was going on now, and how we might learn from what went on then. So I'm really delighted. So immediately I thought of Parami when I watched that, and I sent her a little message, and then the idea for the evening came out of that. So we might refer to "It's a Sin" during the course of the evening. If you haven't seen it, it's really well worth a watch. It really, well, Parami might say a little bit about that later on, but from my perspective, as somebody who wasn't there, it was an amazing evocation of a particular time and a particular place. Yeah, someone's just said no spoilers. I'll be on the alert for spoilers. I might have said too much already. I don't think so. So I'm just going to introduce Parami a little bit for you, those of you who don't know her. So last time I introduced Parami, she was at the Dublin Buddhist Centre, and I went on for about 15 minutes. Apparently, she was behind me, sort of going. So I'm not going to do that. But I think part of the reason why I did do that is there's actually quite a bit to say. She's got quite an impressive CV.
Because I'm old.
What's a delicate way of saying that? Anyway, Parami was in 1980. And she's done a lot of things in her life in the order, some of which we'll hear about. She's also one of the people who established our movement in Spain. So she was the chair of the Valencia Centre in Spain from 95 to 2004. She's also been a preceptor since 2004. She's acted as one of our order conveners. So basically keeping an eye on helping the order to come together internationally. She's a centre president, and I got to know Parami in particular on the International Council, probably mainly. I've been part of that for a few years. And what I've always really appreciated about Parami is just a kind of a fulsome, wholehearted engagement with life, which really means an engagement with people. When you're with her, she's really there with you. It's she just feels like somebody who's got a deep responsiveness to other people. And the joys and the sufferings of life, just a really, really deep responsiveness and warm-heartedness. And I get the impression with Parami as well, just looking at what she does and hearing from her friends and just thinking about what she's done in her life, that she's somebody who really just wants to help people and actually does help people, really has helped people. And one last thing I'll say just before I ask her some questions is I think, sometimes there's something that's emblematic of a person, some particular, I don't know, practice or teaching or image. And the image that I have of Parami, which is emblematic for me of her, is her leading the Bodhichitta mantra. So it's a particular mantra which is sort of focused around the Avalokiteshvara mantra, but includes this mantra which is about the arising of Bodhichitta. So I always think of her leading that particular mantra and saying Om Mani Padme Hung and then tapping her leg 4 times to get the beat right. So anyway, you're very welcome, Parami. And I've already said a little bit about why we're here, what the idea was. And but I just wanted to maybe just rewind a little and just maybe you could tell us how you got involved in Triratna, where and how you got involved in Triratna when it was the FWO.
Yeah, I got involved in Glasgow in October 1977. I was still quite young. I was 25, and I'd had a really rough period just before that, and I was doing a lot of drinking and drugging and rock and roll and all that. And for various reasons, I'd been traveling, but I found myself back in Glasgow. And I realised I was not really in a very good state. And then I thought I was pregnant, which would have just been pretty awful, really. But so I went to a pregnancy advisory place. This might be a bit more detail than you expected. But anyway, I went to a pregnancy advisory place to have a test, and it was negative. But while I was sitting, I just thought, I've really got to change my life. I really was at a bit of a kind of edge point. Anyway, I thought, I must change my life, And I walked out of this pregnancy advisory service, and there was a poster on the wall facing it which said, change your life. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And it was a very iconic scene of Glasgow Docklands, which was quite meaningful for me because it's where my father had worked. My dad was a trade union man in the docks. So as a teenager, as a kid, I used to go down there quite a lot. So it was this kind of, whoa, change your life, this very iconic scene. And I just rung up the number on the thing and said, what's this all about? And it was the men's community actually in Glasgow, which is where they did the classes then. So that same night, I just went to hear a talk, which was a recorded, actually, it wasn't even a cassette. It was a reel-to-reel talk of Sangharakshita talking about the new society. And I thought, yeah, right, great, sign me up. So that was how I bumped into Triratna.
So, and then you must have gotten really fully, wholeheartedly engaged because you ordained 3 years later, though?
Yeah, a bit less than 3 years. Yeah, no, I knew pretty well immediately that this was how I wanted to live my life. And I think it was because I'd come from quite a political background, and there was something about the way Sangharakshita talked about the Dharma. Interestingly, the very first, that series of talks that I heard was Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow, which in it, they're a little bit, they were a little booklet for a while. And what he's saying in that is you can't change the world if you don't change yourself. But the point of changing yourself to some extent is to change the world. So that just seemed ideal. I thought, I'm in a state, I can't change my library books at the moment, let alone change the world. So maybe working on myself is quite a good idea. So yeah, that was pretty quickly I got involved. I moved to London to live in a community in 78.
Oh, right.
Because there weren't any other women in Glasgow at that time that were either available or free or wanted to live in a community. So I moved down to live in a big community in East London.
And was that your first time leaving Scotland?
No, I'd been travelling quite a bit before that. I've always had slightly, itchy feet and a restless soul.
Okay, yeah. But anyway, so you found yourself in London in 1978. And can you say a little bit about what it was like, what London was like at that time? Because I always think of that as a very particular time. I don't know, late 70s, early 80s.
Well, it was interesting because I'd known London quite well beforehand because I mentioned rock and roll, and I had actually travelled a bit with a band for a while, and I'd lived for a little while in London, just for about 4 months or something. So I kind of knew London, but the London that I knew was the drug scene basically, and the kind of, music scene. And then I was living in this Buddhist community where everybody went to bed at 9 o'clock. I had no idea what they were, I just thought they were really weird. They obviously thought I was pretty weird. But amazingly, we all got on very well, but I think they just didn't know what had hit them. I used to go out and I wouldn't come back for a couple of days because I still had old friends in other bits of London.
And how did that go down in the community?
Not great with some people, but I think so it was a bit weird. So I think I had this sense of two different Londons, really, two kind of different worlds, which interestingly has often been my experience in Triratna.
Yeah. So you've had an
Yeah,
engagement with one
yeah,
world or one scene, and
yeah,
also the
yeah.
Triratna scene. So can you?
So so we're moving into that, you know, the whole area that you kind of wanted to talk about the HIV and AIDS world. That
Yeah.
was a bit like that because, you know, I was very engaged with that, and I was living in a women's community. I was doing a lot of teaching at the LBC. I was helping them set up the cherry orchard, and I was doing a university degree
Oh,
all
right.
at the same time.
Because when we had that conversation, you were talking about that time in London, I was really surprised. I kind of, partly because I thought, well, where did she find time to have, you know, because I knew you'd been involved in all that other stuff. And then you were saying you'd been involved, you know, in helping out with responding to the AIDS crisis. And I didn't. I was quite surprised, actually. But maybe just before we get into that, you could say something about the gay community at that time in London before HIV and AIDS, just because it was, again, a very particular time. Anyway,
it was. I mean, again, because I moved to London in '78 and I was living in a Buddhist community, I wasn't that engaged with the gay scene, but I did know it quite well because I did know quite a lot of people from previous times, and also because I'll be very personal here, but like I'd considered myself bisexual. I'd had a relationship with a man. I even got married. That's a whole other story, and we won't get into that now. But at this point, somewhere around 1980, early 80s, I realised I wasn't really bisexual. I was definitely a lesbian. And so I was kind of getting back into that scene a bit. And and I can't remember what year it was. I got into a relationship with somebody also in the Sangha. And I was her coming out relationship. So she was kind of exploring the gay scene a bit. So we did used to go quite a bit to clubs, dancing and stuff. And then as I got more involved later in the 80s, because of doing HIV counselling, I got to know so many gay men, some of whom I'd known before, but some of them obviously kind of a bit newer acquaintances.
And do you remember, was there, I remember a particular moment with COVID last year when I was watching something about a nurse from North Italy talking about what was going on. And I remember sort of realizing, wow, this is something big, you know, it's not just a little thing. It's not just the flu. It's something quite frightening. Did you have a moment like that with HIV and AIDS? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think I did. I mean, I remember, interestingly, although I was in London, the first person that I knew who died of what later, it wasn't even known as AIDS at that point. They were still talking about gay cancer. So I can't remember what year it would have been, maybe 83 or 4 or something. Anyway, he was somebody that I'd known from Glasgow that I went to school with. And his parents had thrown him out of the house when he came out as gay when he was about 15. And my family took him in for a while. He came and lived with my family. And I hadn't kept up in touch with him that much, but through mutual friends, I heard that he had this weird disease and that he'd been told he had cancer, but it was all kind of very murky and nobody quite knew what it was. But he was the first person that I knew who then died. And looking back, it obviously was AIDS. Well, it was AIDS. His partner also died a bit later. And he was diagnosed as being HIV positive and then went quite quickly to having AIDS and died of pneumonia. So, and they weren't in my life so much by that time, but through mutual friends, I heard about that. So that was the first time I kind of thought, oh gosh, this is actually bigger than, you know, just a few people. So.
And then at some point in the 80s, you decided that you would get involved with helping respond.
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
I went to see a play called Torch Song Trilogy, which some of you might have seen. There was a movie made of it, but this was a play in the West End. And in the programme, there was a kind of an an advert, or like looking for volunteers basically for this very new organisation which was just being set up called the Terence Higgins Trust. So my memory's not very clear about which year that would have been, but they had just set it up. They were still they moved not long after I got involved with them to Gray's Inn Road, but they were somewhere else before that. It was just a very small kind of place. And yeah, so I went along there and said, look, I'm interested in volunteering. And because I had a counselling background, I went quite quickly into working. I had a bereavement counselling background, actually. So then I went quite quickly into working as an HIV counsellor, and I did the helpline. So for those of you that have seen It's a Sin, no spoilers here, you all know there was a helpline. There's a scene where they're sitting in the helpline, and it's so authentic. It's so like how it was. So yeah. So that was kind of how I got involved, really. It was just because I saw a thing for it. And I can't remember. I could remember up until, I can't remember it now, but I think I was something like volunteer 200 and something. I mean, they've got thousands and thousands of volunteers now. But it was still a relatively small organisation. So most people knew each other.
And what was it like? And I mean, I can imagine, people talk about the gay community, and did it feel like that? Did it feel like a community?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And I think as people got ill, their friends rallied round. And I think one of the reasons why it was quite a strong community was quite a lot. I mean, it was mainly intravenous drug users and gay men that were, or men who had sex with men, because, yeah, that was more accurate in a way, really, because a lot of the guys who were coming to me for counselling were married men who didn't identify as gay, but that meant that they didn't think of themselves as at risk.
Right.
So that was one of the big education campaigns that I got involved in, was the kind of trying to get away from talking about people looking at behaviour rather than identity.
Yeah. Okay. I suppose this was all taking place against the sort of background of Thatcher's Britain. And can you say something a little bit about the kind of the atmosphere? Because I think I've read into it quite a bit and seen films and read books and things. And can you say, because it's a very particular kind of atmosphere.
It is, but you have to remember London was always a bit different from Thatcher's Britain.
Yeah.
In a way that I think it still is to some extent. So you had Ken Livingstone as the chair of the GLC in the 80s, and a lot of, before Thatcher dismantled it, whenever that was, sometime in the
This the Greater London Council, right?
Yeah, sorry. The Greater London Council was a kind of umbrella body that looked after all the different areas in London. They each had their own councils. So there were some of them were really progressive. Haringey was really famous for doing a lot of LGBT stuff. But then you also had Thatcher coming in with Clause 28. There was all the Clause 28 stuff, which was a bit later, wasn't it?
It was 88.
It was, yeah, late 80s. So that was cool. That was all kind of coming together. So
maybe you could just say what Clause 28 is for those who weren't around.
Clause 28 was a local authority initiative that said that people couldn't teach homosexuality in schools. But what it basically meant was you weren't even supposed to mention homosexuality. And it meant that there could be no sex education around anything that wasn't heterosexual, straightforward, you're getting trained to get married sort of thing. So it was a huge thing for the gay community, that clause, because it meant that not only could there not be any sort of discussion or education about sex or sexual activity, but that therefore meant there couldn't be any education about safe sex. If you didn't have sex, you couldn't be safe, sort of thing. So those worlds did collide a bit. And although it wasn't Thatcher herself who brought in 28, but it was definitely, her government was definitely behind it. And so I remember going in lots of marches, actually. And quite often on those marches, people from the 10 Seconds Trust, people living with AIDS, living with HIV, would be at the front of those marches. So there was quite a coming together of those worlds. It was very political in a sense. It was political because it was life and death as much as anything.
Well, I think that's what's so sort of striking about that time is literally people were sort of fighting for their lives and fighting for other people's lives, which is quite affecting watching like films. There's a particularly good one called 121 Beats Per Minute about France, which I thought was particularly good about that, just the kind of desperation of the time and also the adversity that people were confronting.
There's also, it's very American, but it's not irrelevant, film called And the Band Played On.
Okay.
Which is long, actually. It's very long. And it's based on a book with the same name. And it was about patient zero.
Okay.
There's a whole thing about who patient zero might be. So yeah, that's quite a historical piece in a way. It's very of its time, but it's worth it's worth seeing.
Yeah.
It's, as I say, it's quite long, but it's mainly set in San Francisco and New York. So it's all about the bathhouses in San Francisco and trying to close them down for public health. But it was the only place that gay men felt they could go and be open and out at that time. So there's a lot of kind of politics and health, and which I think again is something I'd say that's coming into play again at the moment.
Right. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, for example, the way the vaccine's being rolled out now for COVID vaccine, it's like Pfizer and AstraZeneca and these places, they're not allowing generic copies. They're very expensive. The way Pfizer in particular has incredibly difficult storage conditions. A lot of countries are just not going to be able to use that. And there's a whole thing about, people say, oh, we're all in the same boat with COVID, and it's a load of rubbish. We might be sailing on the same sea, but we're definitely not in the same boat. I'm in quite a privileged wee boat, thank you very much, in my nice flat, and I've had wind jag already, and et cetera, et cetera. If I need a test, I can get it online. I've had to do that once, but I talking to people in India, for example, or people in Venezuela or Mexico, it's just not like that. So I think there's a lot of political choices that get made that will have a big effect on how the virus is treated. And even say locally here, it's very obvious that the areas, Greater Glasgow, is quite mixed. There's areas where a lot of money and there's a lot of poverty. And the areas with a lot of poverty have a much higher prevalence of COVID than the areas that don't. And you can see why. You've got people living in tenement buildings, maybe with 5 or 6 in a family living together. It's hard, much harder under those conditions to follow the kind of guidelines than if you're living with your partner in a semi-detached in a nice big back garden,
Yeah.
So I think there are choices,
yeah, and maybe and people, like just sort of rewinding a little bit again back to days gone by. Well, people did die. Presumably, people that you knew and that you were close to passed away at that time. And watching some of these films, listening to some of this material, reading books and so on, you do get the impression of just an awful lot of like really quite traumatic levels of loss.
Yeah, I think there was.
Did you experience that personally?
Yeah, I did. Partly friends, but also a lot of clients. A lot of the people I was counselling either died or their partners died. Just not long before I went to Spain, because I moved to Spain in 92. So I worked, I kept on doing counselling stuff for the 10 Seconds Trust until just a couple of months before I left to go and live in Spain. But I was ready to stop, partly because I can't remember if it would have been the end in 91 maybe, No, maybe it was a bit earlier than that. Anyway, I went to 14 funerals in 10 days.
Wow.
On one occasion. I'll never forget that, because just sort of going, like, one day I think I went to 3 funerals. Yeah. I sang at quite a lot of funerals. I used to get asked to sing at funerals.
Yeah. And was there a particular song that you sang?
Yeah, there were a few songs for the Scots. I used to sing A Fond Kiss, which is, a Robert Burns song, which is all about love and loss. And actually one that maybe some of you will probably know, which is the Parting Glass.
The Parting Glass, yeah.
That was a popular one.
And you managed to sing, did you manage to get through? Because that's quite a thing to stand up at a funeral of someone that you knew and sing that song. You managed to get
I got a lot of experience. And the other one that was very popular in the kind of gay male world was The Rose.
Oh yeah, Bette Midler.
Yeah, so I sang that at quite a few funerals. But yeah, no, interestingly, as well as working at the 10 Seconds Trust as a counsellor, at some point I started doing meditation classes in the London Lighthouse, which was another place which also had a kind of hospice attached to it.
Was it an LGBT kind of outfit? Or?
Mainly. It was mainly, yeah. I mean, there were other people did use it, but it was predominantly gay men, and a lot of the staff, the nursing staff and people were from that community, but not all. But and I started there because the 2 close friends of mine who were dying, they both did die. Henry was from Glasgow and his partner Derek. And so they got me to start going there and doing meditation classes. So I did that for quite a while as well. And interestingly, well, I think this is interesting. I love the little connections, the Manchester Buddhist Centre had the big one, the one they're in now.
Yeah.
At their opening, they had a series of talks, and they asked me to give a talk on something about death. I can't remember what it was. For a while, I was the go-to order member to give talks about death. The Grim Reaper arrives. And anyway, I gave this talk, and I talked about my 2 friends, Derek and Henry. I talked about going to Spain with Henry to drive him around at one point. And Apeksha Priya was there, and he was videoing the talk. And he came up to me afterwards, and they were really close friends of his. Mm-hmm. But we'd never met one-to-one, but we'd moved in exactly the same circles. We probably had been in parties together and stuff like that, but we didn't actually ever get to know each other. But we'd so many mutual friends. So it was a bit like that as a world. There was, you were one step removed from everybody virtually.
Yeah, a world within a world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, so you're part of a Buddhist community. You're an order member. You're living in a women's community, and you're also daily talking with people who are dying, or lovers are dying, or friends are dying. And what difference? I mean, you're being a Buddhist, going for refuge to the 3 jewels. What difference did that make in terms of the way that you responded to that situation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wasn't actually doing it every day. There was a period where I was kind of formally doing maybe about 4 days a week or something. But I would sometimes talk to friends outside that formal setting. Yeah, well, I think, I don't know if I could have done it without having a Dharma practice. And, I felt I had resources. And it's quite funny because people that know me, there's a few of you in this call that know me a bit. I'm not somebody you'd necessarily consider and describe as calm, I don't think. I'm not somebody that you would go, oh, she's got such a lovely calm kind. But interestingly, it's all relative, because for a lot of the people I was working with who were completely off their nut, a lot of them, I was quite a calm influence. I used to find that quite amusing, really. But I think because I did have I had a meditation practice, which I'd had for quite a long time by then. So sometimes in the say on the helpline, it would get a bit mad, be calls coming in a lot, and sometimes quite distressing calls, sometimes quite funny calls. And so I think I was somebody that was able to stay quite centered in that. Whereas, you know, it wasn't that I wouldn't get upset, but I could hold it. I think I had a big enough container for my emotions. So I was a bit of a come to person. Sometimes people would come and say, oh, can I just have a chat with you about something? So I think from that point of view, having a Buddhist practice, also having a community to go back to. I said this to you the other day. In some ways, people didn't quite get what I was doing, but they were so supportive and kind of very loving, you know. I remember going back one time after having done 2 long shifts on the helpline where somebody had been talking about suicide, and I think probably had actually gone off and done it. And there was no way we could get to him. There was no way of knowing who he was or where he was. And I came back to the community, and I remember Damadasan, who lived in the community at that time. I actually got into bed beside her very chastely, just because I just needed to be under a duvet with somebody, you know, and just told her about the day I'd had. And she was, you know, just kind of listened and then went and made me a cup of tea kind of thing. So people were remarkably supportive. So that gave me, I think, quite a good place to come out of. But I think I said this to you as well. Actually, I'd say that it worked both ways, because I think the work that I was doing and being faced with impermanence so much definitely fed into my Dharma practice. I think gave me a depth of experience in my Dharma practice.
And can you say more about, I mean, maybe it's impossible to say more about that, but can you say more about that? Like what how that sort of seeped into you? Because I can imagine just being confronted with that's those kinds of facts.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think probably everybody here has had the experience at some point of loss, you know, whether it's the end of a relationship or death, or, you know, maybe in their own life having to face an illness or something, or, you know, awful things that can happen to people. And maybe again with the COVID pandemic, you know, I imagine some of you here have probably, you know, known people who've died. Maybe you've lost people yourselves. Maybe some of you have had to deal with COVID, you know, the illness yourselves. So I think, you know, that can kind of just put you in touch with reality in a certain way. So I think I was getting put in touch with reality kind of like pretty well all the time. You know, I remember hearing a talk from somebody, a Buddhist, talking about dukkha. And I just thought, well, you have no idea, pal, is what I actually thought, listening to this person, because it was very theoretical. It wasn't a bad talk, but it just felt, it was so theoretical. And I just thought, oh gosh, but it's kind of not like that. You just get on with it, really, don't you?
Did you ever feel, the expression that's in my mind is kind of punch drunk, just in a way unable to just really just to be with what was happening, because there was just so much of it. Like 14 funerals in 10 days is a lot of funerals.
Yeah, it was. And I think, you know, I used to drink a bit, to be honest. Looking back on it, I probably drank too much, because we used to get free drinks in various pubs in London.
Oh yeah.
So after a shift, we used to sometimes, there was a place called the Bell, which was a kind of disco pub in King's Cross, and with your THT, with your 10 seconds trust ID, you could get into so many places free, and you could get free drinks at the bar. So I think I probably took some refuge in alcohol, which, you know, was not that helpful in some ways, but
understandable.
Yeah, so I think that kind of punch drunk feeling sometimes was a bit there, yeah. But again, I mean, I was lucky in that I went in a lot of retreats, you know, because there weren't that many women order members to lead things at that point.
Yeah.
So I often did go in retreats. So probably in a year I'd go and, I don't know, you know, if you added it all up, I probably had a good few months of retreat every year. And I would try and make sure I had a solitary, even if it was only like 10 days or something, just to kind of recharge a bit.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think I was quite good with my boundaries. So
you had sort of space within your life. You had space to absorb and to digest what was going on.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to. I don't know. I kind of feel like I need to ask you. Did you ever kind of pray? Was there a sense of, you know, Praying to someone or something.
Well, yeah, I did a bit. I mean, actually, to be honest, I pray more now than I ever did then. I'm quite into prayer these days. I mean, having talked about the alcohol thing, I actually do go to 12-step meetings because I did realize at some point that I was using alcohol really unhelpfully. But so within that context, I pray a bit. But yeah, I think I probably did have, I think I had a strong connection with my visualization practice that I do. So I don't know, there's 30 odd people in this call. I have no idea because I don't know you. Some of you, whether what I'm talking about is going to make any sense. But at ordination, order members often take a visualization, or we call it a sadhana practice, where there's a particular figure that you might meditate on. And the one that I meditate, particularly then, the one I took at ordination was Avalokiteshvara, who's the Buddha, the Bodhisattva of compassion. So I think I did call on that figure quite a lot. So I don't think I would have said I was praying at the time, but in a way, what's in a word, really.
Yeah. No, I
definitely call on Avalokiteshvara.
I guess, particularly in Avalokiteshvara, the kind of myth of it, there is a sense of the enormity of what you're facing and needing to call on something above to be able to hold the...
Yeah, I think that's right.
I
remember I used to sometimes come out, having done the helpline for a couple of shifts, go to the bell, dance, even if I wasn't drinking, I used to dance a lot, which was actually quite a good way of getting rid of some of that kind of tension. And it was disco dancing, this is the late 80s. It was, and it was quite fun. And I get absolutely kind of sweaty and let go of quite a lot of stuff. And then I would get the night bus back to Bethnal Green and then walk. It was like about a 15-minute walk. And I often used to chant mantras when I was walking back up the road. And it felt like I needed a bit of a transition.
Right.
Before I went back into my Buddhist community in a way.
It's a bit of a change of energy, I suppose.
Yeah, there was, definitely a bit of a...
Yeah.
I remember sometimes I used to come home to go to a community evening, if I'd maybe been doing some face-to-face counselling during the day, and then I'd come home and go to the community night and we'd be talking about, like, should we put the money up a bit, or I don't know, it would be some, like, I used to sometimes find it quite strange having to make this, the fact that so-and-so hadn't actually done any washing up for a couple of days, and I just think,
there's people crying. Yeah.
So yeah.
And what about, I mean, have you reflected on this time and that time and any parallels or kind of lessons to be learned, or I don't know?
Well, I think one thing that, I think I said this to you, Jnanadhara, that maybe about April, May last year, when it was becoming clear that it was actually a pandemic and not a kind of isolated thing or whatever, I did remember thinking and saying to people, maybe in my chapter or something, the order members that I was talking to, that I could feel there were quite a few parallels. There was a lot of fear, for example. And there's something about contagion, about something being contagious, which I think particularly then, it wasn't that clear how the coronavirus was being transmitted. It wasn't that clear how exactly you got it. And it was similar to that in the 80s with HIV. It was like, there was a period where it wasn't very clear how you got it. And there were all sorts of fear stories around it. And, people would think they shouldn't touch a gay person, a gay man, because they might catch AIDS. There was a lot of fear mongering and a lot of kind of, I guess it's the fear of the unknown. And I think it's almost a bit biblical myself. I think there's a fear of plague or something.
Right. Okay.
A fear of contagion. There's something about it being dirty, being, even though rationally and reasonably, and I think that's less now with COVID. I think that, it's much clearer in a way
Do you mean like
So,
some kind of deep instinctual evolutionary
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
force?
Yeah, I think so. Even a bit of fear that, how would you get this? And, I can remember myself that when we were coming out of the first lockdown, because I'd come back from somewhere and we went straight into lockdown like 2 days later or something. So I was in my flat and just like in a few mile radius of where I lived. And then it lifted a bit into the summer, whenever it was. And I remember getting on a bus and just kind of feeling a bit like it's a bus, and there's people in this bus that aren't wearing masks. There's a bit of kind of, I could feel that in myself.
And
A slight kind of discomfort.
yeah, and like, I mean, I suppose aversion's a problem from the Dharmic point
Yeah.
of view, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, how do you work with that? Because it's quite quite a deep instinctual fear response that can very easily turn into aversion.
Well, I think acknowledging it's important, and not telling yourself you shouldn't feel like this or something. I think you need to acknowledge it, but then I think it's also important to really kind of educate ourselves. So I think that was one of the things, particularly in the 80s and into the 90s, where there was a lot of false information around about HIV and AIDS. And so I think then there was a lot of fear because there was misinformation. And I think once people started getting a sense, well, that you didn't catch it just by sitting next to somebody, and also that once you also got medication, I think that made a big difference, because then when I was first working in that world, if somebody was diagnosed as HIV positive, they took it as a death sentence. That was it in a way, even though in fact it wasn't for a lot of people, but that was the kind of message. And I think with COVID, there was a little bit of that at the beginning as well, particularly when you'd see these scenes in Italy or Spain of these hospitals and, people dying and not being able to, families not being able to be there. I mean, obviously that's still the case to some extent, most places, but there was that kind of whole thing of just seeing these bodies in hospitals. And so I think now that there's a bit more sense of how it works, a bit more sense, there's a test that seems relatively accurate on the whole. And then there's a vaccine, which, we'll see how that goes, but looks like it does make a difference. So I think there's a sense of kind of coming out of something a little bit.
Yeah. Were there other aspects, other kind of similarities about, for example, about the way people die and the way that the people who are left respond to their death?
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the things that I remember thinking that seemed quite similar, particularly early on in the pandemic, was there was a kind of loss of dignity around death and dying, which again I think is changing. And I think, honestly, I think, I mean, I don't really know about Ireland, but the National Health Service here in Scotland has been extraordinary, really amazing, I think. And so I think even if somebody was dying on their own, people would really go out of their way to try and make sure that they'd have somebody, or, using electronic means to be able to be with people and stuff. But I remember at one point way back and that you see this a little bit in It's a Sin, that people were isolated. If they had AIDS, they were isolated. And
it's one of the more heartrending aspects, I think, of it, with those scenes. Yeah,
you couldn't go in to visit. I remember going to visit people and having to completely gear up, with
mask,
PPE.
gown, gloves.
Yeah. And then, of course, that changed as it became clearer how transmission. But also, I remember there was a period, some funeral directors wouldn't pick somebody up if they'd died of AIDS. They wouldn't want to do the cremation or the funeral or whatever. And I think that changed fairly quickly, but there was probably a couple of years maybe where that was the case. And probably outside the big urban places, it remained that way for quite a bit longer.
Right.
So if you lived in London or Glasgow or Edinburgh, presumably Dublin, there was some that kind of slightly more urban Yeah. Whereas if you lived in a wee village in the Highlands of Scotland, I mean, you were pretty snookered if you found yourself living with AIDS. They were a lot of the calls we used to get on the helpline, where people living in sort of little places where literally they might have been, wouldn't know anybody else who was gay, let alone anybody else who had HIV.
And how would you respond to, like, was there a particular, I mean, how would you respond to someone in that situation?
Well, part of it would be informative, sort of making sure that people knew what resources were available in their area. And so there would be a kind of fairly pragmatic sort of side to telling people, well, actually, if you can get to such and such place, or here's some phone numbers of people local to you that you can talk to. But some of it was just listening, really, as well, just sort of listening to people's worries and concerns and try to help them work out for themselves what would be the best thing to do.
I remember a scene, this is not a ruiner, but someone answers the phone at the helpline and the other person just doesn't say anything.
Yeah.
They're just, so this very strange scenario of knowing that there's another human being at the end of this phone call, but there's nothing coming from them except the fact that they exist.
That was not uncommon.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was quite usual was it changed as well, but I remember when I was first working in the helpline, we used to get lots of calls from what we called the worried well, who were people that had never been anywhere near the HIV virus. They'd never done, but they had convinced themselves because of this sort of misinformation that they were ill. And they would want to tell you their symptoms in great detail quite often. And some of them were quite unsavory. And, you try and get them back to saying, well, where would you have caught the virus? Have you done this? Have you done that? Try to get back to the behavioural thing. Yeah. And they'd be like, no, but can I just tell you about my penis is very sore? And you kind of doing it all on headphones, so it's right in your head. Some of those sort of images. And you try and reassure them, and they'd say, I think I should have a test. And you'd say, well, do that if it will put your mind at ease. But it's one of the best, one of the ones I remember was this guy phoning up saying he thought he might have AIDS because he'd found a dirty gay magazine in his back garden. And it seemed a bit dodgy in so many ways.
But, but it says a lot about the time, doesn't it? That someone might think that and might actually ring you up, and presumably they were being quite genuine when they asked you that.
Oh, yeah, and you had to take it seriously. You couldn't just say, oh, for God's sake, don't be daft. Which is interesting. One of the things that I used to remember, actually, was the story of Kisa Gotami.
Oh, yeah.
Which is from the Pali Canon, where the woman with a dead child goes to different people to see if they can cure her baby. And they say to her, don't be stupid. This baby's dead. Of course you can't cure it. But the Buddha doesn't actually do that. The Buddha says to her, well, I can help you. And then he gives her, a condition under which he can help, which is that she finds a mustard seed from a home where no one has ever died. So she then goes off and she discovers that everybody has lost somebody at some point in their life. And I used to remember that when people were phoning up, were obviously out of the, stratosphere kind of stories. And I used to think, well, they mean it. It's, it's not going to help for me to say, don't be daft. Of course you have, how would that be helpful for anybody? So,
because in a way that they're actually frightened that they might have a fatal disease. And it's genuine. Yeah.
And sometimes when you dug underneath a little bit, actually, you'd often find it was people who were gay, but they hadn't come out. And, all sorts of stories would start kind of coming out. So I used to spend too long. I used to get told off for spending too long sometimes in the worried well calls.
Yeah.
But it was because, I would think, well, if you've gone to the trouble of ringing up this number, you're worried about something. So because
I imagine even that just ringing up, like you couldn't. Yeah. I suppose now you're just anonymously be able to go on a website and get a bit of information or do a chat.
Yeah.
But back then I remember I mean, I remember ringing a gay youth group, you know, and
Yeah.
picking up the phone and putting it down, and picking up the phone and putting it down, and
It's a big
leaving it
deal.
for 3 weeks, and then picking it up, and finally actually dialing it, you know.
Well, it's a big deal. And, people would come for counselling sometimes. And, the fact that they were walking into that building and walking into a counselling set up took a huge amount of courage in the early sort of days of that.
I mean, there's an HIV charity. It's actually tragically closed down now, but they said that I was up there. They wanted us to be involved with their charity, the DBC, and they were saying that 50% of people who get an HIV diagnosis don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
And that was like 5 years ago.
I was going to say that still, yeah.
And I was absolutely shocked by that. They don't tell anybody, 50%. So there's still this stigma around
That's
it.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah. Can I just mention one other, or ask you one other thing? I mean,
yeah.
I remember you saying to me that, some people would ask you, how did your generation survive this?
Yeah.
And it sometimes you really do. I mean, like I say, I've heard interviews with men who had, driven their partner to the hospital and they'd died in their arms, and just had a horrific trauma of it. And so, how did you survive? How, and is there anything we can learn about that, bouncing back or coming to terms with something like?
I think sense of community made a huge difference to people. And again, without giving anything away about It's a Sin, because I think Russell Davies has really captured that era incredibly sort of accurately. I mean, he lived through the tail end of that, so you can tell that, he knew that world very well. But, there was a real sense of people kind of coming together and looking out for each other. And also because quite a lot of the young men, say, that I was counselling, their families didn't even know they were gay, and then they were having to tell their parents maybe that they were gay, and in the same breath tell them that they had contracted this disease. So, which was how it was thought of and how it was described, they'd caught this terminal disease. So that was hugely traumatic for so many people, and then people that weren't allowed to go to their partner's funerals and things like that. So I think all of those things meant that the gay community really, really sort of came together. And I think that's something that, again, I saw that at the beginning of this current pandemic, where, people really did rally round, and the Scottish government opened a volunteer helpline, a volunteer service. And it crashed within 10 minutes of them opening it, because something like 500,000 people signed up within the first 24 hours to volunteer. And, you could do anything. I did some listening for a while, actually. Just talking, just people, ringing people up. But, there were all sorts of initiatives of people doing shopping for folk, and it was really well organised. And as far as I know, that was happening in a lot of neighbourhoods and in a lot of areas. So, one of my dreams is that when we come out of this, we don't just go back to business as usual. I really hope that we can come out of the COVID pandemic into what, is being called the new normality, whatever that looks like, that it might have a more resilient economy in it. It might have a more, sustainable kind of life, maybe a bit more simplicity. I think one of the things about I used to find this, dealing with death or loss of any kind, it pares away what's unnecessary, I think. So you go to the heartwood and let the deadwood go, as it were. And I think that's something that, as Buddhists, there's a lesson in there, I think, for just how we live our life generally. Are we prioritizing the important things? Are we prioritizing friendship and community and love and, all those things over some of the things that are less helpful to the planet and to each other? If that isn't a bit too hippy dippy.
No, it's wonderful. It's a lovely note. Maybe we could pause there.
Yeah, people still awake, because that's been Quite a long, because I can't see everybody on the stream, so it could be well out having a kip as far as I know.
Well, the thing is, let's see. There's still 37 people plugged in, so it's pretty easy just it's pretty easy just to log out if you want. So
that's true.
Well, just to say that there has been a request, Parami, for a song.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Would you do it? Would you do us? It's also we just had St. Patrick's Day this weekend, so maybe would you do us a verse of the Parting Glass?
I probably could do that, yeah.
And then maybe that would be lovely. And then maybe we could have a break. And then
you do know the Parting Glass is a Scottish song, don't you? The Irish keep trying to claim it, but it's not. But we're all Celts together, aren't we? So it really doesn't matter.
Great. So yeah, that'd be lovely, Parami. And then we could have a break and maybe you come back and answer a few questions if people have questions.
Yeah. You want me to do it now?
Yeah, I reckon. Yeah, lovely.
Okay, I might just see if I can find the words in case I don't remember them. I should know. I sang this the other day actually for the college meeting. Vajashura's not here, is he? Because he helped me the other day. Oops. Okay. What, just a couple of verses?
Yeah, just as much as yeah.
Okay, this is slightly embarrassing, but anyway, never mind. Of all the money that e'er I had, I spent it in good company, and all the harm that e'er I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be to you all. So fill to me the parting glass, and drink a health whate'er befall. And gently rise and softly call. Good night and joy be to you all. I'll stop there, yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Fantastic.
I didn't expect that.
Good. I'm glad there was something a bit of a curveball for you.
Yeah.
Anyway, Parami, look, hey, we'll have you back in about 10 minutes, but just for now,
Okay.
just thanks so much for just giving of yourself so generously and also sharing your thoughts, and also you quite a big chunks of your life so generously and so kind of candidly and openly. Yeah, it's a really real privilege to hear. So guys, it's what time is it? It's 3 minutes past. So maybe let's just come back at 1:15 just to make it easy. And so 15 minutes past. And if you've got any questions for Parami, you could put them into the chat and I'll put them to her. And then we're going to finish the evening with meditation. So we'll do some Avalokiteshvara mantras and then do a period of metta bhavana to close. So yeah, so we'll come back at 1:15, and yeah, and just chuck in any questions if you have them. Talk to you soon.
I mean, the big motivator for me was the whole Bodhisattva ideal. That was the kind of strand of Buddhism that interested me, really. The idea that when you practice, you're not just practicing to be a better person or a nicer person or something, but that the whole kind of drive or orientation of practice is to create the conditions to alleviate suffering. And partly you're doing that by teaching the Dharma. If you're doing that, because that allows people for themselves to start to look at the conditions in their life and how we cause suffering, how we add to suffering or whatever. But I think for me, it's always been important that it had a bit of a practical aspect to it as well, that You know, you actually kind of do something. I mean, I grew up in like a Catholic, Irish and Italian Catholic household. And, you know, from very young, that whole sense of like service or something in a positive sense, I think, was quite present.
And you said your father was a trade union man.
He was, yeah. My dad was actually in the Communist Party until he left with over Hungary.
Oh, right.
The
And that
invasion
was
of
in
Hungary.
68, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And I remember him and his friends kind of, they used to come to our house. This was something that I sometimes think back on. My dad was the Scottish editor of the Esperanto Times. So Esperanto, because some of you are quite young, so you might not have come across Esperanto, but the idea was to create a language that was kind of composed of different European languages, but that everybody would learn it. So then if you could all talk the same language and communicate across the races, war would end, peace would prevail, and we would all live happily ever after. So that was quite a strong, I remember as a kid, they used to do, it was a Gestetner machine. It was in our living room, my granny's living room, big bit of machinery. And my dad and all his pals would come and run off the Esperanto Times.
Wow. So it's in your blood, Parami.
I think so, yeah, I think so.
There's a question from Stephen. Do you remember when contracting HIV was no longer considered a death sentence because of improvements in medication?
Yeah, I couldn't put a kind of time on it, to be honest, but I remember the AZT was one of the big changes, where it was the first medication that seemed to make a difference. But in the early days, terrible, terrible side effects for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It took a while to get the doses right, so that people were taking too high doses or not enough. And it was all really complicated about when you had to take it. You know, so you used to have this thing where I'd been in a meeting, say, of the counselling service at the THT, and there were quite a lot of the people that worked there were HIV themselves. So you'd be sitting in a circle, you know, going round, and then you'd hear all these alarms going off. You know, people would have like, you know, watches, no smart watches like you have these days, but they'd have something that they would go off every 4 hours.
Yeah.
Because they had to take their doses every 4 hours. So it was like this little cacophony of different sounds going off. And then I can't remember what year the cocktail came in, where there were the 3 drugs that they found out. It must have been in the early 90s.
Because you said you left in 92, was it sort of around then?
Yeah, I think it probably was, because it was starting to kind of happen. It wasn't so easily available at that point as it is now.
I remember I was just reading about Derek Jarman, the British filmmaker. And when the piece I was reading said he died in 94, just as those life-saving drugs were beginning to become more widely available. So
yeah, that'd be about right.
That puts it about 94.
Yeah, because so I left there. I mean, I still kept up with some people that worked there for a while, some friends, and it was quite a big thing. I mean, one of the things that happened then as well was that Wellcome, the pharmaceutical company, started to fund a lot of research around HIV and AIDS. And that was quite political in that world, because some people thought it was like a bit of a sellout to be at the behest of big pharma. On the other hand, the government wasn't giving any money for research, or very little, you know. So whereas the pharmaceutical companies, they had invested interest in research, but the research was then available and, you know, had its effect. So I remember a lot, that would have been around 92, because it was just as I was leaving. I remember going to a meeting of I was on the volunteer council at one point, and going to that, and that was a big topic of discussion, whether it was right that an organisation like the Terence Higgins Trust would get into bed with big pharma.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Can you say more on the balance to achieve? Keep in mind can you say more about the balance to achieve? Keep in mind between acknowledging truthfully where one is and keeping the vision alive. Thank you for the song.
Thank you. That's a good question, isn't it? And I think the answer is no, I cannot say more. As in, I think it's really difficult for people to find that balance. I think it's something that we constantly, almost whatever you're doing, need to be keeping looking at. I mean, one of the, I don't think you can keep the vision alive if you're not able to acknowledge where you actually are. I think that's one thing I'd say. I think otherwise it becomes disassociated. And in terms of, say, Buddhism and practice and vision and all that, you might have come across the idea of spiritual bypassing. The idea where maybe somebody is so driven by the vision that they don't take their whole self into account. And I think that's why you get burnout sometimes. And certainly working in the HIV world in the 80s, a lot of people got burnout. You know, quite a lot of people I was working with, completely understandably, because there was such a drive to kind of really try and meet the needs of people. And some of the counsellors that I worked with got quite burned out. So I think you have to be able to acknowledge the effect that something's having on you.
Yeah, there's another question similar. How did you manage your energy with counselling, teaching at the LBC, community living and studying?
I have no idea. When I think back on it, I remember talking to Sangharakshita about it at one time. He, by the way, was incredibly supportive and interested in the fact that I was doing that work. Whenever I went to see him about anything, he'd want to know how it was going, and was kind of very interested. But I remember saying to him, people keep telling me to slow down. But a lot of my friends would say, you're doing too much. And he'd say, well, do you think you're doing too much? I said, well, I don't feel like I am. And he was saying, well, trust your instincts in a way. And then he'd sort of laugh and say, well, we need more working class Glaswegians.
So somebody once described you as, that book, was it Being Nobody, Going Nowhere?
Oh, that's right. It was Damadina.
Parami being everybody, going everywhere.
That's right. She said she was going to write my biography.
Is that, funnily enough, the next question was, did you ever talk with Bante about what you were doing with the gay community?
Oh, I never saw that.
Yeah,
I did a lot, actually. Where's the question? Is that all it says? Did I ever talk to
it's from Pavara. It's in two parts, yeah.
Hello, Pavara. Yeah, I did, actually. I mean, I used to talk to him about everything, really. I had quite a kind of personal relationship with Bante. And I always used to find he was interested in everything, really. But Dhammarathi once told me, his friend of mine, he once told me that one of my charming qualities is that I assume that people are interested in me. And it pays off, because generally if you approach it like that, they end up being interested. So there you go. But no, Bante was always quite interested in what I was doing. And very sort of, I mean, I think he used to say to me he kind of would have liked more order members to be doing more of that sort of thing.
Right. He seemed to have, my sense of him was he really wanted order members to involve with people's lives and doing things, engaged, and not just kind of huddled away and kind of sequestered off.
That's right.
Is that your impression?
He was always very keen that, he used to say things like, you need to be good citizens. By which what he meant was, if you live in somewhere, get engaged with it. I remember talking to him when I went to Spain about starting to learn Spanish and, how I was getting on with that. And I remember actually talking to him about a girlfriend I'd got involved with this woman in Spain. And he said, oh, well, it might help you to get engaged with the local community. And I was saying, yeah, I'm not sure that's the best kind of reason. But he said, well, I'm not recommending it as such. But, at the same time, it will mean you get to know people. And he was always keen that we didn't just, even say at the LBC, which was the centre, the London centre I was in before I went to Spain. He was really keen that it was the East End, that people should know it was the East End and be out and about and not kind of have this closed little we're okay sort of a place, really.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, have it as an oasis, because an oasis is needed, but not as a closed kind of, don't close the doors.
There's a question. I was also wondering about what you learned during your work with fears and ignorance of HIV/AIDS, about dealing with such fears, etc.
I think I had to learn patience. You know, Kshanti or patience has never really been my strong suit. But I think that thing about taking people seriously and not kind of, I mean, I think that's sort of relevant now as well, in terms of like ignorance and false news and misinformation and all that kind of thing, that I'm currently quite involved, would be one way of putting it, with the Scottish political scene. So I don't know if any of you bother following such things, but it's kind of quite turbulent at the moment, the Scottish political scene. And there's an election in about 7 weeks or something. And there's so much misinformation. Oh my God. There is so much. The mainstream media are just outrageous in the misinformation. And because I'm quite involved, I know it's misinformation, you know. So I get really angry. I mean, what I've learned over the years is that my predominant negative mental response to the world is anger. That's, you know, I ranging from mild irritation to outright fury, you know. So I guess one of the things that I've learned is that, well, there's two things come to my mind. That's one thing, is that it doesn't help to get like that. It doesn't help me if I get really wound up, and it doesn't help anybody else. And the other thing that I think I've learned, and I think this was relevant working in that kind of field and dealing with ignorance, was you can't respond to emotional fear with a rational, logical response. It just doesn't work. It really doesn't work. So that's one of the things about false truth. And, you know, like if somebody has an emotional attachment to something, you're not going to move that by giving them facts and figures. So I think somehow I've learned that I need to be able to enter into, like, connect with a person. You know, so like, for example, politics is really polarized at the moment, isn't it? It's very polarized here in Scotland, but it's polarized everywhere as far as I can see. And, you know, there's no point in dealing, like I talked to some distant family members who, well, they're not my direct family, they're kind of married a bit further afield. And they're the only people I know actually who are Tory. There's not very many of them in Scotland, but these people are, and they just believe everything that they read in the Daily Mail. They totally believe it. It must be true because it's in the Daily Mail. And, you know, whenever I have a conversation with them, I have to prepare myself because I can just feel myself immediately kind of getting quite jumpy. But there's no point in it because it doesn't go anywhere. And actually what I have learned at times to do is try and kind of get into why it is that they hold the views that they hold, and again, what's underneath it. And quite often it's fear of losing something. You know, it's fear of, like, you know, if Scotland becomes independent, for example, they'll lose this, that, and the next thing, which is probably not true, but it's kind of the fear that's there. So I think I've learned that I need to meet people with on their own territory. And then maybe once there's a connection, maybe then you can kind of get a bit more
brilliant,
reasonable.
Yeah. We've got one last question from Casey. You touched on this. Can you say more about the sense of the gay LGBT plus becoming a kind of family, supporting each other through the crisis, particularly when people's biological families may have rejected them? Also, what was your favourite disco song to dance to?
I Will Survive.
I Will Survive. That's very appropriate.
Well, it was the song of that era, you know. I can still remember dancing and that pub that I mentioned in a line to that and doing all the actions, you know. Just turn around there. Anyway,
yeah.
You know, I think, Casey, I think, you know, that was just very much a feature of that people had to kind of get a sense of family from somewhere. I mean, people used to talk about family of origin and family of choice. I don't know if they still do particularly, but a lot of people's family of origin weren't able to cope with some of the things that were happening. I mean, again, if you haven't watched It's a Sin, they deal with that really well. I think in that you know, some families are better able to deal with that than others. So, and I think, you know, it's like people used to say, oh, this is like being at war. I never quite liked that idea, but I guess if you feel that, you know, others are against you, or whether it's your biological family or society, or, you know, I once thought, I wonder if you identify most strongly with the group where your oppression is shared, if that makes sense. So, because that's what bonds you, which can be very helpful. And then I think it can also become quite limiting in a way at times. But, you know, I think we do look for like, don't we? We look for support in what's like us. But I think also that there was a strong sense of allies, which I think is still the case, you know, still needed. So although the gay community, the LGBT, I mean, when I was young, it was only LGB, and then it became LGBT, and then it became LGBTQ. And I mean, frankly, I've lost track somewhere along the line, if I'm completely honest. I just sort of slightly off track, but I was at a meeting last night of SNP Socialists, which is a group within the SNP, and I nearly got elected as the LGBTQIA plus officer, but I managed to avoid it. Anyway, but that's what it was called there, LGBTQIA plus. Sorry, that's by the by. But I think, you know, even then it was really important that it wasn't just the gay community that were pulling together and kind of like creating a family or a community, because then it can become a ghetto, I suppose. So it was also important that there were people who were working in that world who weren't from the LGBT community, you know, that kind of bridged a gap, I guess, sometimes, something like that. Allies were important.
Brilliant. Thanks, Parami. Thanks again. You've just given so generously of yourself, and it's just been I've just been fascinated by your perspectives on both then and now, and also all the things you've been doing with your life then and now.
I hope it's relevant to the Dublin Sangha in a sense, because it's a bit niche.
Yeah, well, I think there's some. I think what's interesting about it, there's some universal themes. It was a particular time, a particular community, but there's some universal things which I think are relevant.
Yeah, good. I hope so.
Just about, you know, being a human being, living in a world where people suffer, and actually finding some way of responding, which is both a point of growth for oneself and also a point of growth for the community as a whole. I mean, that's an eternally relevant question, isn't it, in the Dharma?
Yeah, I just suddenly had a little thought at one point, is this a bit overly niche for a Sangha? A bit niche, you know. Yeah.
Well, people are still here, but we'll do. Nyaneshri saying, I work with HIV, HCV, and STIs, so the niche is okay for me, Nyaneshri.
Good, thanks, Nyaneshri.
So what we'll do now is, Parami, would you like to lead the Avalokiteshvara mantra off for us?
No, I think somebody else should do it. I think I'm a bit hoarse now.
You're a bit hoarse.
But can I just say, do invite me back sometime to talk about something less niche.
Okay, we'll do. Yeah, you'll be welcome. You'll be very welcome. I would love to have you back, Parami. We'll do it.
I've got a very wide range that I can.
So what we'll do is, I'll just lead off the Avalokiteshvara mantra. We'll do it for a wee while, and then we'll go into a period of metta bhavana. So you might like to follow the stages, or you might like to just sit and sort of soak in what we've been hearing about. So we'll do that for about 25 minutes. Like I say, I'll ring bells at the stages, but just feel free to do what you want. And then we'll do the transference of merits at the end just to close the evening.